I'm Jake Boritt. I'm the Gettysburg Film Festival director, and it's wonderful to be back in Gettysburg College's Majestic Theater for another film festival with Ken Burns and his collaborators and friends. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Bob, Susan, all of you at Gettysburg College, and everyone in this town with the Historical Society and working together to make this all happen. The staff of the Majestic, the Historical Society staff has been tireless, working hard to get this all together. And now we have a really special morning, and it's already been special with the Better Angels showing two amazing films by young filmmakers. And it just struck me, I was sitting next to Ken as we watched them, and many of you know the story, the novel The Killer Angels Ken read in 1984 and decided that his next film in 1984 was going to be about the Civil War after reading a book called The Killer Angels. And of course, we all know Ken produced the Civil War series, PBS ratings records, and he became Ken Burns as we know him and forever associated with our town. And then I think it's such, in doing that film, he certainly came across Abraham Lincoln's writings and, the inaugural address, or he calls to the Better Angels. And I think it's sort of a beautiful story that he starts with the Killer Angels, and now we're seeing the Better Angels in Ken's work, and hopefully many generations to come inspired by this. So today we are going to be joined by Ken, of course, and his longtime collaborator, Sarah Botstein, amazing filmmaker. And we have a clip reel, and it's called Our Democracy Challenge. And what we've done, working with Florentine Films and the Ken Burns Unum Project, is to take clips that are specific to a theme. And in this case, it's about really severe challenges in our history to American democracy. And we're going to watch it. I'm not going to say much more. Sarah's work will do the talking for us. It's intense. It's some hard stuff for sure, but we need to look at it because I really do think our history has a lot to guide us both right now and in the future. So here's Ken Burns. Sarah Botstein will be on stage afterwards. This is Our Democracy Challenge. Thank you very much. Ken Burns and Sarah Botstein. Well, thanks for being here. It's a pretty somber Saturday morning, not quite Saturday morning cartoons, is it?
No.
But
there is the cartoon in the Des Moines Register of Hitler applauding.
There are some Hitler cartoons, yes. So our democracy, it's always been challenged. It's been challenged since before it was a democracy. Why do we need to look at it?
Well, we need to look at it for all the ways that Nell Painter and Timothy Snyder just said in the film that Sarah and Lynn Novick and I directed on the U.S. and the Holocaust that you just saw clips from. To me, we're in an age when we're limiting the access to history. We're proscribing what you can talk about. You are seeing many states passing legislation that limits how we could teach it to not upset people in a world which is almost perpetually upsetting in almost every regard everywhere, that people by age 4 or 5 begin to perceive that it's tough, and that we're a species with 100% mortality. Betty Carter, Mrs. Harding Carter, in that film says it best. She wants to categorically dismiss Huey, but she says we all have the worm in the apple. And so I think owning that, to me, the key to this clip reel, which we watched in the green room, was that we have to own our stuff. And we have to own our stuff we all know as individuals, or at least if we don't own that stuff, we know how impossible it is to be with others, to raise children, to have friends, to work in an environment and collaborate with other people. But at the same time, that extends beyond the worm in our individual apples, but all the worm that has been around in our collective apple for an awfully long time. Sarah and I are now directing a film on the American Revolution, and it is very clear that we were born in violence, that all of the things that you saw in the Civil War, all of this clip, all of the things you saw in the multiple Huey Long clips, and all of the things in the Lindbergh and the sort of denouement of the Holocaust film, they still are here. They were there then, and they're still here, and we're wrestling with those. And so we have to do that in order to have Lincoln's vision of his second inaugural, or the vision of the first inaugural of the better angels of our nature, is to say that it requires a kind of rigorous self-study and a self-discipline. As it comes to each individual, we can't regulate that. We can only do that for ourselves and the people, our children. But as a country, we can demand collectively of ourselves that we examine with a kind of unflinching eye where we've been and see the extent to the fact that we constantly take a situation, and sometimes the path of least resistance is to move towards something that is anti-democratic. You know, I was saying last night that Jefferson says in the Declaration, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. We've been subjects for all of human history. We're inventing this new thing, citizen, but it's going to be really tough. That it's going to be easier to slip back into that response. And the one thing, I may have said this last year, which is I have been making films about the U.S. for 50 years. But I've also been making films about us. That is to say, the lowercase two-letter plural pronoun, all of the intimacy of us and we and our, and all of the majesty, the complexity, the contradiction, and even the controversy of the United States. And what I finally understood, it took country music to bring me there, was that 3 chords and the truth, you know? I'm so lonesome I could cry. I still miss someone. It took me that long to sort of realize there's only us, and there's no them. And the hallmark of all authoritarians is to other. That is to say, there is an enemy, it's a them. And in order for them to advance their agendas, they have to create a them. They have to other people when there's only us. And so when you see somebody saying there's a them, just run away. And I also want to point out that as much as we've been, thank you. We have been discussing all yesterday and today this notion that, you know, of Ecclesiastes, that what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. It sort of echoes and rhymes, as Mark Twain is supposed to have said, really powerfully. And I know particularly in these clips that it rhymes, particularly in the Huey Long thing. The thing that was so interesting about Huey Long is that he was, for all the egomania, for all of the alcohol abuse, you know, for all of these dictatorial things, and he was ruthless beyond belief, and leveled, as I.F. Stone said, the liberties of the Republic in order. He wanted to get things done for the poorest people. He wasn't giving a tax break for the wealthy. They were the them. And so you've got now that study, as Robert Penn Warren said, of power and ethics. So what happens when actually his ethics are pretty interesting? This idea of a democracy, every man a king, and the redistributing the wealth had a kind of appeal in the midst of the Great Depression. He just used the same sort of methods that we abhor, the authoritarian methods that we see in Viktor Orban, we see in Vladimir Putin, we see in Xi and in Kim Jong-un. And so, you know, these are, you know, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse out there that we don't want to become, you know, and so we want to be resistant to those. And these are complicated moral dilemmas, but the one thing, and I've gone on way too long, and Sarah should comment, is that we all have the worm in our apple. Betty is absolutely right.
Well, yeah, and this film is certainly highlighting the worm, right? I mean, with the clips we saw, and you're seeing that, and you've dealt a lot with this in your work, and why do we have to keep looking at that worm, Sarah? The evil, it's there going back to ancient time, Ecclesiastes, wherever you want to go back to, you'll find it, right? And so why is it so, difficult but necessary?
Well, because we want to be optimistic that we can maybe move forward and not keep repeating some of the things that we seem to keep repeating. And there is this, notion that no matter how many films we make and how many wars we examine and how many complicated moments in American history we take a look at, there is something, I think, for us that's interestingly both comforting that we keep sort of making different versions of the same mistakes over and over again, and so we can try to be optimistic about moving forward and doing it differently. That there is, I think, inherent in our founding and in our democracy something about the privilege of living in a working democracy, and to use our work to try to highlight what's important about that. And I think just in listening to Ken just now and to watching the clip reel, I think, film has a magical way of bringing together both this intimate dynamic of the individual human experience, the collective experience of our history, and then the interpretation of that history. And I always like to say that the great thing about working in film is, it is collaborative to make a film, but it also is collaborative to put people together in a film to help us understand our past. And those are people that don't often inhabit the same dinner table. And we put them in a dinner table conversation that we are eavesdropping on, and therefore want the country to eavesdrop on, because we believe that, I think, the study of the past is the most helpful, constructive teacher. It's not destructive. I have 2 kids. I don't want them to learn the same thing over and over again. I want them to learn how to listen to one another, how to have differences of opinion, how to make the world a better, more listening place. And so that's, I think, sort of the ethos of what we do.
In Jay and Abigail's films, there's all of that. Everything that you saw there. You see a problem that comes from intolerance or just the obstacle, the threat of a disease, right? And then you see people working, and then you see the inevitable retrenchment. You see the regressive tendencies. There's something incredibly mournful in both these films that have a kind of optimistic, progressive sense of our history. Progressive in the sense that we're moving along and we're getting better and reducing the number of deaths from whooping cough, and we're opening up more pool. And then you see the reaction and the retrenchment, and you go, my God, this battle never ends. It becomes kind of axiomatic and therefore cliched to say that liberty and freedom require a certain vigilance, but it's absolutely true. Authoritarianism is the yielding of a day-to-day vigilance. Oh yeah, okay, just take care of it, right? Those poor people. As you watch the opening of Huey, he's funny and magnetic with the high papalorum and low papahirum, and then you just see, the Bigglers sitting in the Atchafalaya River, and you see Edmund Riggs sitting in his bed in squalor in St. Martinsville, and you see Alcide Verret out on the thing, and you see this, and they're all saying, no poor people hated them, and you realize you're dealing some with great, and then a woman in a high-back chair, followed by a judge in a high-back chair, just talks about killing him. And by the end of the film, you have switched entirely, and you see not them. They're not without sincerity, but they've invested in an idea that he was never going to deliver. I mean, he did deliver some stuff. There were roads, there were bridges, there were schools, there was access to hospitals that they'd never had before. That's an amazing, you would almost say socialistic thing. And he came from a dirt poor North Louisiana parish, Wynn Parish, that had refused to secede from the Confederacy. They saw the Confederacy as a rich man's cause. They weren't going to die for somebody protecting his right to own somebody else. And so Wynn Parish became this hotbed of radicalism and populism, even socialism. They went for Eugene V. Debs in one of the elections, one of the 6 that he ran for president. And then we're able to spawn this complicated populist hero who's also a dictator. And so I think that we are obligated to have that kind of vigilance and just to resign ourselves to the constant fact that it has to be watched at every time, right? And you cannot let it go. If you let it go, then you end up subjects and ask the people of Russia or China or North Korea or Hungary how that's going.
I think one of the things that struck me, you're sort of seeing this span of, almost 200 years of these threats to American democracy, which is this amazing idea. It's an experiment, but again, constantly under threat. But the means of which the same worm, the same kind of thirst for power or control or money, whatever it is using different tools. And I think you see that with what the Confederacy is using versus what Lindbergh and the America First movement was using, and up, even they're mentioning very brief, the McCarthy, very short bit of McCarthy there, but obviously television becomes a big role in the technology of media, trains in the Holocaust, what the Nazis were using. This is all technological development. And it almost seems like we always think technology is going to lead to this better life for all of us, be it a train or social media or whatever. But obviously it's constantly used for these worm purposes, right? And so... Well,
it's inevitable. I mean, this is human nature, right? There's going to be people who are going to dedicate their lives to helping people in a war zone, feed them food when there's no hunger. And they get killed sometimes. And there are going to be people who are going to do the killing or cause the original rupture that did that, or are going to say, just because your skin color is different or your religion is different, I'm a Christian, you're a Jew. So is Jesus Christ, by the way, who never intended for his teachings to become a separate religion. Just the people who listened to him decided that they could do that. So we have hugely complicated dynamics that we're required to follow, and all of these have technologies, because human beings are an inventive species, that are going along, and they are serving the same kind of morphian ends, putting us to sleep, the same negative ends, becoming the agents of our own enslavement, and also within that, the seeds of our own further liberation. So it goes back to Robert Penn Warren, right? Who's saying it all depends on what you do with the dirt. Everything is dirt, but what you do with the dirt in this dynamic of power and ethics, which is the age-old human and historical story, what are you going to do with it? And that's the question that we have.
Yeah, I mean, the longer I do this work, the more we talk about three things. One, how do you have power and do good, and how the people who have figured out how to do that have the longest tail in terms of what we should admire. And then how is it that in the human experience, those who are either the victors or the victims continually cycle in doing terrible things to one another? If you've been oppressed, how do you, when you rise up, oppress others? And how, if you're victorious, do you then use that victorious power to do something terrible to the oppressed? And the tension of those two things repeating themselves in history over and over and over again is really endlessly fascinating, sort of devastating, and we see that today.
Sarah and I made a film on the Second World War called The War, and the fourth episode of 7, the sort of central episode, the longest episode, is basically from June 6th to the end of August and the liberation of Paris in 1944. And you begin to realize, and it's incredibly moving to me, to think of the greatest invasion in the history of the world, took place as British and Canadian and American forces, Free French forces, Free Polish forces, but mostly the first three, landed in Normandy. And they weren't there for empire. They weren't there for conquest. They weren't there for loot. They were there for an idea. And there were kids from Iowa and Nebraska who are about as far away from danger as you could possibly be, from Laverne, Minnesota, who the Germans weren't, and they were planning to invade the United States eventually, and they were training a cadre of people that were learning the languages, and they had somebody assigned to Adams County, I assure you, and they spoke fluent English. It was without an accent, and they knew exactly what was going on, every river, every stream, and they knew what they were going to do when they got here. It was going to take them a long time to get to Iowa or Minnesota or Nebraska. And same too, if the Japanese military conquest had succeeded as they wanted, they thought they would be able to move east. They're there for an idea, and they're willing to sacrifice their lives, and we see that all the time. And I think as Sarah is suggesting, the actions of an Abraham Lincoln, back before that George Washington, his example, resigning his military commission and then serving only 2 terms when everybody was happy to have him be His Excellency for life. And he goes, no, I think the highest office in the land is citizen, and I'm going back to that. And George III says, well, then he is the greatest character of the age. His old adversary, he realizes the extent to which the giving up of that is the most noble thing. And Lincoln's sacrifice of himself for the country, FDR sacrifice, a man who cannot stand alone, unaided, lifts us out of the Great Depression and the Second World War and leaves us a legacy. Do you like your national parks? Do you like, the trails that are there? Do you like the 10,000 airstrips he built? Do you like the Triborough Bridge or the Lincoln Tunnel? Do you like, having your Social Security check? These are all legacies of a man who was born to the manor, who was called a betrayer of his own class because he wasn't into tax breaks for the wealthy, right? And you know what the Old Testament says about that, right?
No, tell us, Ken.
It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to reach the kingdom of heaven.
There you go.
Less applause because there's some rich people here, and they're really worried about how much they're actually where the scale is going to come down, as we all are who are successful.
There's no them, Ken.
There's no them.
A favorite Irish poet said that America's the greatest idea we've ever had. It just hasn't happened yet.
Right.
Amen.
That's Paul Hewson, a.k.a. Bono. But to that point, your idea, it's an idea. It's not, and we're seeing this very clearly on the fringes of Europe right now, this idea of ethnic, that you belong to an ethnic or religious idea, and that's who you're fighting, or race, and nationalism. And there's certainly a nationalism in America, and I think it's still this idea that bonds us together. And I think what you're seeing with your films is you're obviously getting these, be it Lincoln or Frederick Douglass or Jackie Robinson, these voices from the past. But what I'm realizing as we look especially deeper into your catalog, there's voices from the past that were not in the past, like, an Arthur Schlesinger, or David McCullough last night on the Civil War. I know James Baldwin's in a film. We saw Tom Wicker, Ed Bars. I know a lot of you are fans of Ed Bars. Like these people that are now, belong to the ages, so to speak, but they're in your films, and they're also now testifying to their thoughts and this idea of these people, not just Lincoln and Douglas and Susan B. Anthony, but there's Ed Bars and there's Shelby Foote, and they're talking around this dinner table too. And why do we have to keep hearing these ideas as they evolve? Is there an evolution here? And how do you do that filmmaking? How do you balance that within the construct of a film? Contemporary voices, historic voices, and now historic contemporary voices.
Well, that's in the top 5 things that we get to do is figure out who's going to talk about a subject. I don't think there's really, at the beginning of a project, what we do is figure out who in the world is an expert in that topic, whether they're going to be inside our tent helping us tell the story or we're going to film them on camera. And, when we're doing subjects where people might still be alive, we're making a film about LBJ's presidency right now, so we're scrambling. If you're over 80, we want to interview you now, even if we're not quite ready to make the film. But if we're making a film about the American Revolution, we can't really do that. So we're trying to figure out who in America and now a little bit around the world is alive and can help us understand the subject, both in terms of the facts that are essential to understand it, but to think about the revolution anew. And I mean, it's an amazing part of what we do. And then the art of the interview is just, it's so much fun. It's so great to prepare. It's, we constantly debate with each other about what's important, why is it important. We poke and poke and poke until we're totally convinced by the other person's argument. It's really fun. And it's such a privilege to get to know this cast of people, both who are witnesses to history and those who are trying to understand it.
So one of the things we do when we're faced, as Sarah suggests, by the absence of somebody who's alive, in the Civil War, we couldn't interview anybody. We did talk to a 103-year-old woman, Daisy Turner, who recited a poem that she had learned from her father, but even then she was not alive during the Civil War. Is that we use, in addition to the third-person narration, often read by Peter Coyote or Keith David, or David McCullough in the case of the Civil War, a chorus of first-person voices that I sort of became obsessed with hearing from the very first film that I did for PBS, that was on PBS, called Brooklyn Bridge, and that you would hear people talking, the journals, the letters, the newspaper accounts, the various parts, and it allowed us to have a chorus of those voices supplement that. And that then allows you to extend to the subject, not the kind of just top-down version of the past that would suggest that American history is just the sequence of presidential administrations punctuated by wars, which is a really good structure to hang your hat on, but it has to be adorned by bottom-up stories. So it allows you to hear, in the case of the American Revolution, from a variety of people, some of them women, like Abigail Adams, who we've all heard about, but there's a philosopher named Mercy Oldys Warren who's phenomenal. There is a young black enslaved poetess named Phyllis Wheatley. There's a young girl named Betsy Ambler who lives in Yorktown, and stuff happens to her all through the revolution, and her family has to move inward, and they're refugees, and their status goes from rather high to rather low and modest as a result of the vicissitudes and the difficulties of war. There are Native people who have voices in this that talk about the ultimate thing that's going on, which is land. There are Africans that are enslaved and are free, that are part of the American dynamic. There are recent immigrants. There are not just the George Washingtons and the Thomas Jeffersons and the Madisons and the Hamiltons sort of thinking great thoughts afterwards, but there are people that are engaged at all levels with a battle, a scared soldier, a German Hessian mercenary scared, a baron who's there sort of leading troops from Germany, and his wife that comes along with their children, all surrendering at Saratoga. I mean, the dynamics of it become important, and the way we solve the riddle of what do you do when there's not a witness, as we had in World War II or in Vietnam or country music, is to give full voice to these first-person voices that allow us to do it. And then the great trick is to be able to go to people like Martin and like Sam Waterston, and we've just, Meryl Streep and Laura Linney and Maya Hawke and Ethan Hawke and Damian Lewis and Hugh Dancy and Claire Danes and Matthew Rhys and literally dozens of other voices that are making the revolution come alive in our ears. We don't see them, they're off camera, but you understand, these are people like ourselves, right? If we accept this, nothing new under the sun, then you've got that chance to create a tableau that has dynamics and dimensions, suggests this has a human part to it.
And thinking about democracy and to piggyback on what Ken was just saying for the Holocaust film, the interesting way that we got at the witness versus the historian issue was that we found a number of people who were children as the war was coming into being at different places in Europe, and their families ended up making it here, none fully heroic or happy, all of them tragic, but they were children then, and then built lives in America. And so I think one of the human experiences that Ken is speaking about in finding the voices for the revolution is that we all tend, and you can feel it in audiences, to lean in when there's a child's story at stake, because we all are either parents or our children. So for the Holocaust Project, to talk to people about their memories of childhood and what they do and don't remember and why they do and don't remember those things, and that even in a moment when America's response to what was happening in Europe is very complicated and not always positive and rosy, those families that did make it here understood the preciousness and the power of American democracy and are some of the most patriotic and interesting people to talk about what America does well and what it has done poorly, and how to think about that from a childhood's viewpoint was really very powerful, and I think informative for what we're doing now.
It's a huge point that Sarah has made, and you cannot deny it. Often these people look like, because they are, in their 80s or their 90s. But who we are talking to is a child, or a teenager, or a young woman, or a young man. And we did an interview with a man in his 80s who had been in World War II, and the interview wasn't going very well. I think he was, anxious about being on camera. And finally I just said to him, "You saw bad stuff." And the 80-year-old disappeared, the cheeks started to twitch, the eyes started to crinkle, and he was 19 years old, kept referring to these kids that were coming. I finally said to him, "Wait a second, how old are you and how old are the kids?" And I go, "Oh, I was 19. I said, "They were 18. But he'd been there for almost a year, and how old he was the difference between an 80-year-old and an 18-year-old. What he knew about life and the worst parts of life, which is the taking of life, war, was spectacular. And all of a sudden, we made a film on the Dust Bowl, and I suddenly just said, we're talking to children. The things that they remember were when their parents were upset. And what were their parents upset? This thing that was destroying their crops and their cattle and their own children with the dust pneumonia. And so you realize, I'm not talking to some guy, brothers that are in their late 80s. I'm talking to the 10 and 11-year-olds that they were when this all happened. And it's really, really powerful.
I think in the Vietnam series that we did, it's the exact opposite. Actually, the scholars don't appear on camera.
None.
They helped us behind the scenes get the history right. But the people that we interviewed were either soldiers on the front lines, people who were protesting the war, those questioning what to do, those who left the country because they couldn't stand to be here anymore, and who our ally and who our enemy were in Vietnam. And, the experience of the people talking about what happens to their families when their families are divided as our country came apart. I think it's very interesting now in how we're understanding our democracy and when it is our political obligation and right to protest and question our government, and still keeping in mind the privilege to live in a democracy and to exercise your right to vote. And I think, a film like Vietnam helps you see all of that, and the farther we get away from it, the more important those things are to study.
We went to great expense as we were finishing the film to make a Vietnamese language version of the film. We didn't need to do that. Vietnam, unlike China or Russia or other oppressive regimes, does not control their internet. And because some people who had been influential in teaching the generation of leaders of Vietnam had been helping us, they had given us sort of unfettered access relatively to archives, to locations, to people. So we could interview Viet Cong reunion groups or North Vietnamese, now Vietnamese soldiers who reunion, and we could get that. We released it simultaneously. It's still there. It can be streamed for free, and millions of Vietnamese have had access to it. And I'm not saying it's destabilizing, it's a repressive regime, but they're one of our most important strategic partners in Southeast Asia, ironically. And, you know, you could have skipped that. You could have in 1956, when the Geneva Convention of 54 had said free elections, you know, we can have that. We were kind of, no, we're going to divide into North and South, and then we're going to not have those elections, which Ho Chi Minh would have won. And, you know, we'd be in a different world with 3 or 4 million more Vietnamese and Laotians and Cambodians still alive, and 58,400 and how many Americans still alive, and a lot of tourists not have gone under the bridge. So it's pretty interesting the way in which the work on this centers this dynamic. You know, scholars behind the scenes or in front of the scenes. And yesterday there was a kid who was asking us at the Gettysburg College about the Vietnamese thing and asking about the scholarship. And we had 23 scholars who were all cutting edge in each. Somebody knew the presidential tapes of Johnson and Nixon, which, by the way, have not only not been transcribed, they haven't all been listened to. So that we discovered in the course of our working, just listening, having one of our colleagues just listen all the time as they were doing other work, we discovered tapes that hadn't been there. And another scholar had done work in recently declassified or got access to North Vietnamese military information, which meant that the version of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we think we know exactly what happened, is now a much more complex rashomon of factors that also feature the desperate dynamics, not just in the American White House to show strength or whatever, but the desperate dynamics in Hanoi amidst the Politburo. So all of those things happen. And so we struggle to be corrigible through every single part of our process to be able to change at the very end, the last day of work.
And how, I mean, so we've talked about all these elements, be it, you know, childhood memories to massive global economic, political, military agreements. How does this all coalesce into a story that people want to watch on TV? How do you make it a story?
Sit in an editing room with him.
I bet.
I think one of the elements that helps us do that, and we talk a lot about this, is, you know, of the elements that go into our films, there's music, there's sound effects, there's voiceover, there's interview, there's live cinematography. But the music is one of the elements that emotionally unites us, and it's a very powerful tool in what we do. And we're talking about Ashokan Farewell and Jay and Molly, who are here and going to play tonight, and what that piece of music meant to the country and still means to the country. In a film like Vietnam, we had a rule in the editing room that if you heard a popular piece of music, we had to make sure it was actually out in the world at the time that we're talking about. So there's kind of we're subliminally saying something with the music, but regardless of what you were feeling or what you were doing during Vietnam, if you hear some of those songs, you're placed right back there. And in the revolution, trying to figure out what people were listening to, how to make new music. Does it matter when the music was written? How does it pull you in and bring us together for a conversation? That's one of my most favorite parts of how we put it together.
Yeah, I think the global challenge that your question suggests, that macro view and the micro view aren't as disparate as they might seem. You know, the architecture of the atom and the architecture of the solar system share a profound similarity of design. And so I think what we try to do is figure out, just as I've spent my professional life sort of in that space between us and the US, to figure out how you go between the solar system and the atom. Sometimes the atom, William Blake said, you could find the world in a grain of sand, right? That's a pretty wonderful English romantic poet, you know, truth there. And sometimes you need that 30,000-foot view to be able to set the table for the experiences, say, as Sarah was saying, the young people in the Holocaust film. And it's a very interesting set of people. We have several scholars, Timothy Snyder and Nell Painter that you saw, and others that you've seen if you've been through this, like Rebecca Belding, who was there last night. And then you have the experience of survivors, we can call them, mostly children. And then in the middle is this wonderful writer who is far and away a scholar, but he's also a wonderful writer, Daniel Mendelsohn, who is the fulcrum between the two, because he dedicated his life to finding out about his great uncle who had come to the United States with his grandfather, or after his grandfather had, but found that the streets of the Lower East Side were not paved in gold, and went back where he could be, to Bolechov in southeastern Poland, where he could be a big fish in a small pond, which he was for a while, but he was married with 4 children. So if you think that's a total of 6 people, Daniel Mendelsohn found out what happened to 6 human beings out of 6 million, and kind of personalized this opaque and impenetrable number, 6 million, that means nothing to us anymore. The better thing that we say is that there were 9 million Jews in Europe in 1933 when Hitler came to power. In 1945, 2 out of 3 were dead, right? You're just left, 2 out of 3. That's another way of doing the math. Just like Mr. Lincoln here doesn't want to say, hey, it's been 87 years. He's asking you to participate in this by going 77 years. He's asking you to do a little bit of work, and by inviting in, and the only reason why we stay in public television is they permit us to ask of our audience of a higher level of attention with no commercial interruptions. Yay. We, can get these very powerful ideas across. And in a way, our work is a way of saying 77.
Yeah. Well, we have time for one last question, as this went fast, but it's wonderful. Back to democracy being challenged and history on screen. This whole weekend is about history on screen. Ken's art, Sarah's art work here. Why do we look at history on screen to help with our democracy, maybe especially when it's challenged?
If you don't know where you've been, you can't possibly know where you are or where you're going. David McCullough used to say that to me all the time. May he rest in peace. And that's it. I mean, we actually, we all in our own lives, both individually and collectively, stand on the shoulders of giants. It's always said that good writers borrow and great writers steal, and
Picasso, right?
And so
Jim Jarmusch.
this is who we are. We are obligated in this moment to gather as much as we can of everything that has come before this moment, the collective human experience, good, bad, and otherwise, the delicious apple grown in Adams County and the worm that's also grown in Adams County, to make sense of this moment so that we can actually ensure a future that has the possibility of not making the same errors that we will undoubtedly make again, but we can also work, because we see that if human nature doesn't change, in some places it does, and for a little bit. I think in Abigail's films, you feel so sad when you see, and Jay's too, that you see that a law's been passed and you now go, that law's under assault now, or the deaths have gone back up because somebody's saying this the vaccination isn't good, and you see the complexity of the human experience and wish for our better angels to obtain. And the only way you know that is by dealing with all of it, the messy stuff as well as the good, positive stuff.
I'm going to steal from him now. I think that one of the things that we try to do in our work is to tell good stories so that people get to history through good stories. And Ken usually talks about that, so I'm going to just do it for him. But to say that, I think our editing room is about telling good stories so that we can learn from our past to make a brighter future.
Our colleague, Joe DePlasco, is backstage, and he, a few years ago, told me about something the novelist Richard Powers had said, that he said, it's basically paraphrasing, the best arguments in the world won't change a single person's point of view. And if you think, ladies and gentlemen, all we do is argue, right? All we do is argue. Everything is on some sort of false binary construct. The best arguments in the world won't change a single person's point of view. The only thing that can do that is a good story.
Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein. Thank you guys so much. Thank you.